Almost every vault experiment in Fallout is horrifying, because that's the point. They were meant to test what people would do in horrible situations, and some will make you question the sanity of the devs that created them. So with that cheerful note out of the way, let's go traumatize ourselves. Vault 13, Death of a Vault Dweller. Let's start with the very first vault shown in the series, Vault 13. Vault 13 was initially presented as a control vault, a vault without an experiment. But here's the question. If Vault 13 was supposed to be a normal vault, no weird social experiment, no cartoon villain overseer, then why did it still end up producing exile, rebellion, and eventually a full-scale Enclave abduction? Was Vault 13 ever truly a control group? Or was normal just another kind of trap? Vault 13, located somewhere in California, often speculated to be near Mount Whitney, was presented as one of the safest bets in the Vault Tech lineup. Nothing flashy, no obvious gimmick, just a sealed community built to outlast the bombs. That illusion held until 2161, when the Vault's water chip failed, turning normal life into a countdown to life or death. The Overseer draws straws and sends out one resident, later remembered as the Vault Dweller, on December 5th, 2161, to find a replacement. Inside the Vault, most residents keep going as if routine will save them. But a rebel faction forms, convinced the Overseer is hiding the truth about the surface and eager to see the world for themselves. The Vault Dweller returns 5 months later with the chip, saving everyone, only to be forced out anyway. You're a hero, and you have to leave. That exile doesn't just remove a person, it fractures the Vault's identity. The rebels finally act, leaving Vault 13 to follow the unknown future that the Vault Dweller proved was possible. The Overseer is overthrown, possibly killed, because the record becomes conveniently fuzzy, and in a move that's both logical and darkly ironic, the remaining residents replace human leadership with a control computer purchased from the Brotherhood of Steel, trading one Overseer for a machine that can't be bribed, guilted, or appealed to. For decades, it worked. That is, until 2241, when the Enclave arrives with a coded all-clear signal, claiming the surface is safe and it's time to emerge. The vault opens. A family of 3 unseals the door, only to meet an Enclave Verdi assault team. They're immediately gunned down, later labeled as resisting capture, the kind of excuse that only sounds believable if you've never met the Enclave. The rest of Vault 13 is kidnapped and flown to the Enclave oil rig for use in a world-ending aerosol plan. And as a final insult, Vault 13 becomes a dumping ground for supposedly failed intelligent Deathclaw experiments, except the Deathclaws aren't dumb at all. They're merely pretending. They turn the vault into their own community, limited less by intelligence than by the inconvenient fact that claws aren't great for pressing small buttons. From there, Vault 13's ending splits into possibilities: extermination, capture, or survival through a voice module that lets Deathclaws interface with the Vault's systems. The good ending is famously bugged in-game, but fans point to later intelligent Deathclaw traces as evidence that it might still be the intended canon. So what was the point of bringing up Vault 13 first? Well, it matters because it exposes a brutal truth. Even when a vault looks normal, it's still vulnerable to engineered dependence, internal fracture, and external manipulation. The failure of the water chip shows how a single logistical weakness can control an entire society. The exile shows that even salvation can be punished if it threatens authority. And the Enclave's infiltration of Vault 13 ultimately proves the vault wasn't just a shelter. It was a resource waiting to be claimed. And that raises the question this video hopes to answer. If this is what happens to one of the most standard vaults ever built, then what did Vault Tech do to the vaults that weren't meant to be normal at all? Let's move to the next vault, where the experiment isn't a hidden twist. It's the entire point. Vault 8, literally, 1984. Do you think the world today is dystopian enough? Cool, because Vault City is what happens when what Vault Tech deems as civilization not only survives the apocalypse, but then immediately decides the real enemy is everyone else. The scary part isn't that Vault City is evil. It's that Vault City thinks it's ethical. Vault City, formerly Vault 8, presents itself as a pristine model society. Clean streets, bright lights, neat and tidy uniforms, and a proper government unlike most of the wasteland. But that shine comes with a price tag. Massive walls, heavy turrets, and a rigid social order that separates citizens from everyone deemed too poor, too dirty, or too wasteland to belong. If you don't meet their standards, you don't get welcomed. Quite the opposite, actually. You get managed, kept outside the gates, and treated like a necessary inconvenience. And the rules don't stop at the front door. Vault City leans leans hard into controlled living, strict civic expectations, tightly monitored behavior, and leadership that speaks to people like they're components in a machine, to the point that their welcome booth has a citizen who relies on nothing but a pamphlet to even communicate with you. Even the little details are telling. When a place starts obsessing over who's fit, pure, and acceptable, you're not looking at a community anymore. You're looking at a filter. But a filter for what? Here's the twist, if you didn't already see it coming. Vault City wasn't even one of the crazy experiment vaults. So why does it feel like one anyway? By 2241, Vault City's biggest crisis wasn't starvation or raiders. It's that the outside world refused to disappear. Their neighbor, the ghoul town of Gecko, created both a problem and a solution. Gecko's reactor helps keep Vault City powered, but it also creates tensions over contamination and undesirables. That dependency makes Vault City furious, because it proves a humiliating truth. Their perfect society still needs help from people they look down on. So they do what they always do, try to outsource their morals. You'll see officials who want compromise, but you'll also see voices in power pushing for harsher options, including using mercenaries to solve problems permanently. Vault City doesn't just fear the wasteland. It wants the wasteland to stay weak, so Vault City can stay superior. This is why Vault City is so important. Even without a flashy Vault-Tec gimmick, it becomes a very intentional prototype for what the Enclave mindset, the same one that gave rise to Vault-Tec and what vaults are known for today, looks like in practice: order through exclusion, safety through segregation, and progress that only applies to the chosen few. Vault City isn't a cautionary tale about chaos without order. It's a warning about stability without empathy. So if Vault City shows what happens when a control vault succeeds, then the next vault we need to talk about is the one where the cruelty wasn't a byproduct, it was the plan from day one. Vault 77, Puppet or Puppeteer. Vault-Tec didn't just love hostile environments, they especially loved impossible ones. Thus, Vault 77 decides to ask one of the nastiest questions of all. If you lock one person away with nothing but silence, how long before they invent a second voice and start not only believing, but doing what it tells them? Picture this: the Great War hits, the door seals, and it's just one man in a vault. No family, no neighbors, no routine, just the hum of machinery in a cardboard box. The moment he understands he's truly alone, he collapses. Days of pounding on the vault door, begging for an answer that never comes. After days and weeks without an answer, he opens the box. Inside, there's hand puppets, a Vault Boy mascot, a grandmother, a king, and a dog. It's almost funny, until you realize the joke is an experiment. Isolation isn't the background, it's the weapon. This is Vault-Tec, stripping away every stabilizer humans rely on: community, accountability, critical thinking, just to see what replaces it. And at first, what replaces it looks harmless, like nothing more than simple make-believe, kind of like what video games are to people: distractions or coping mechanisms from the real-world hustle and bustle. When you have no one, your brain doesn't stay quiet, it improvises. So the man does what a lonely mind always does. He tells stories, he assigns roles, he makes the puppets talk because someone has to talk. The grandmother bakes pies, the king makes grand declarations, the dog barks on cue. It's childish, sure, but it's also survival. He's building companionship out of scraps, stitching a social world together with nothing but fabric and desperation. This is the key tragedy of Vault 77. It starts as coping, but coping can rot into dependency when there's nothing real left to anchor you. And then one puppet stops following the script. But the Vault Boy was different. The Vault Boy spoke to the man. It said things that he didn't make it say. Not comforting things, not helpful things. Devious things, cruel things. One night, the king had been murdered, with the Vault Boy initially taking responsibility, but later revealing it was the man who had murdered the king. That's the core horror of Vault 77. Whether it's possession or projection, the result is the same. The line between actor and audience collapses. The Vault Boy puppet becomes different. Not looking different, acting differently, speaking differently. That's when the vault stops being a shelter and turns into a tragic comedy. No longer just a puppet. The thing that looks like a Vault Boy in puppet form speaks to the man. Not comforting things, devious, cruel things. And the moment that puppet talks without being made to talk, the line between imagination and authority collapses. Then comes the murder. One night, the king is ripped apart, and the Vault Boy puppet takes credit, only to reveal it was the man himself. Possession or projection, whatever, it doesn't matter. The outcome is identical. The man no longer knows where he ends, and the puppet begins. That's the core horror. Vault 77 doesn't just drive him insane, the Vault Boy puppet gives his worst impulses a voice he can blame, obey, and hide behind. And once that voice exists, it doesn't stay inside the vault. Leaving the vault doesn't cure the damage, it simply takes it outside. He finally tries to leave, only to find a warehouse-sized rad scorpion waiting outside, like the wasteland itself is guarding the punchline to a long, stale joke. After that, he moves through the world in fragments. A ghoul from a worse vault, a giant ant he rides, and raiders he kills at the puppet's urging. At that point, the puppet isn't entertainment anymore. It's permission, something he can wear on his hand and call the reason. People don't fear him because he's any kind of tactical genius. They fear him because he's proof that a human mind can become a weapon when it's hollowed out the right way, even with something as friendly and non-threatening as a hand puppet. And the Wasteland does what it always does with cowardice and superstition. It turns it into a legend. Vault 77 didn't just break the man it held captive. It created a myth that outlived him. He became known as the Puppet Man, a name whispered by raiders and slavers, like a campfire horror story. Years later, he holed up in a house demanding tribute from anyone who entered, not so much to enrich himself, but more to keep the puppet happy. And even by 2277, 200 years after Vault 77 was sealed, the sight of a Vault 77 jumpsuit was enough to make hardened raiders and slavers panic. That's the final cruelty. Vault-Tec didn't just run an experiment. They manufactured a roaming consequence, an urban legend built from isolation, paranoia, and a puppet that may have never spoken at all. So if Vault 77 shows what happens when one mind collapses in private, the next vault begs an even worse question. What happens when Vault-Tec makes an entire community part of the breakdown? Vault 34. Bing bang boom. Vault 34 is what happens when Vault-Tec hands a stressed, confined population an entire armory and says, good luck, because once you pack a vault with guns and ammo instead of living space, the real experiment becomes simple. Will the residents protect each other or aim their gun sights on each other instead? America, land of the free, home of the brave, right? Vault 34 took that slogan and turned it into interior design. A big chunk of its living space wasn't more housing or more food storage. It had a state-of-the-art fitness facility, a massive pool, and an overstocked armory. If you weren't into guns and ammo, daily life was basically living inside a gun nut's wet dream. And to make it even stranger, the US Air Force treated the vault like a storage locker, using it to stash a prototype pulse pistol meant for the Chinese and their experimental power armor. So Vault 34 isn't just a vault with weapons. It's a pressure cooker where power, access, and identity are all tied to who controls the guns. And once you give people that kind of leverage, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to use it. Vault 34 doesn't fall to raiders, external conquest, or simply being abandoned. Not right away, at least. It falls to politics. Armed politics. Sometime before 2231, the dwellers revolted against their overseer to leave. And like most freedom movements in tight confined spaces, it wasn't clean. During the chaos, the vault flooded and the nuclear reactor was sabotaged. Systems that should have been monitored, but weren't, especially once maintenance collapsed. The revolt kept everyone's attention on the conflict, so the water and radiation threats didn't come like a slow warning. They hit like a delayed detonation. Years later, by 2281, the surviving inhabitants weren't sore losers whose way of life was proven wrong. They were prisoners of their own making, trapped in an irradiated, failing prison that needed outside rescue. That's the point. The revolt wins, but the vault loses. Vault 34 becomes a cautionary tale about how internal conflict can destroy the infrastructure you depend on to live. And the damage doesn't stay inside the vault either. It bleeds into the wasteland. Vault 34 turns into an environmental problem with a body count. That sabotaged reactor doesn't just ruin the vault. Its radiation spreads far enough to taint the nearby NCR sharecropper farm harvests, turning local food production into collateral damage. This isn't a simple case of, whoops, we set the air conditioning too high. This is the kind of failure that poisons communities that never even stepped inside the vault. So Vault 34's experiment doesn't end with its residents. It creates a long-term regional hazard that reshapes an entire community's economic prospects, and not for the better. But here's the part that makes Vault 34 infamous. Its greatest legacy wasn't the contamination. It was the survivors. The boomers are Vault 34's quote-unquote successful outcome. And that's a terrifying sentence to anyone familiar with them. Around 2231, the dwellers who left didn't integrate. They armed themselves even further beyond the ludicrous firepower Vault 34 gave them. Pulling gear from places like the Hawthorne Army Depot and Area 2, they treated wastelanders as savages, responding with absurd precision and even more absurd overkill. Eventually, they found Nellis Air Force Base and made it home, transforming isolation into doctrine. Over time, they got restless. Some fell in love with the outside world through binoculars, others socialized by shelling anyone who wandered too close. The pinnacle of Vault 34's weapon fantasy sanitism. A weapon-stocked vault doesn't just create armed people or a polite society. It created a culture that normalized violence as communication. And if Vault 34 shows what happens when you arm a community until it becomes a fortress, the next vault asks something even nastier. What happens when the vault itself is designed to push people into fighting? Vault 118, Magnates of Murder. We've all hated a boss. But Vault 118 asks a decidedly more sinister question. What if your bosses weren't just annoying? What if they considered themselves so far above ordinary people that they'd rather seal you and your coworkers out of sheer pettiness than share a bunker with you? Vault 118 was supposed to be another class experiment. 10 ultra-elite residents and 300 working-class residents trapped together, with the workers given limited food and space while the elites lived in comfort. Essentially a testing power play, with scarcity and exploitation imposed upon the far larger working class. But when the Great War hit, the elites didn't wait around to see how that would play out. They shut the entrance and kept the vault for themselves, turning it into a private luxury resort instead of Vault-Tech's intended social experiment. So the experiment flips. Instead of the idea of how will the rich treat the poor or how long the poor will withstand being exploited by the rich, it became the question of what happens when the rich never have to face consequences at all. That is, until they try to cheat the one thing money can't buy forever. Vault 118 became a museum exhibit of pre-war ego, talent, fame, brilliance, and zero accountability. The vault's residents were a who's who of status: a world-famous painter, a General Atomics inventor and his wife, movie stars, and other high-profile innovators. To preserve their paradise, the inventor persuaded the group to transfer their minds into robo-brain bodies for near immortality, swapping death by old age into an eternal country club, metal chassis included. All yours, for the price of everyone else. That choice matters because it removes the natural endpoint that forces reflection. If you make it so that you'll live forever, you can make it so you never really have to experience guilt forever too. But immortality doesn't stop human greed. It just gives it more time to take effect. Vault 118's real collapse isn't mechanical, it's moral. After about 210 years, the fantasy finally shatters when Ezra Parker, an investor, kills Juliana, the wealthy heiress wife of Burt Riggs, after she discovered that he had been embezzling her money before the war to fund Vault 118 and buff his own finances. To maintain the illusion, Ezra takes Juliana's place, an identity swap that only reveals his true nature. Burt suspects something is off, but he's too consumed by his work to fully confront it. That's the real horror of Vault 118. The elite don't just avoid consequences, they will try to rewrite and reshape reality to escape them. And then, just when Ezra thinks he can keep its secrets buried, an outsider walks in. A visitor from Vault 111 arrives, someone with no stake in the social hierarchy. Perfect for the residents to ask for help solving the murder. Sounds like a certain type of detective story. From there, the investigator can dig up the truth or slap a name on the crime and leave. Either way, the Vault's paradise keeps running unless someone wipes everyone out. But the important thing has already happened. Their sealed ecosystem has been punctured, and with it, the dissolution of the comforting illusion that wealth makes you untouchable. Vault 118 ultimately delivers Vault-Tech's intended lesson, just not through worker revolt. Instead, the elite get a taste of reality through the betrayal of their own. On the note of class division, we'll take a trip to West Virginia to see what's been going on over there. Vault 63. Storm over Skyline Fallout's pre-war America didn't just collapse because of inflation, resource shortages, or war paranoia. It collapsed because the people with power kept building escape hatches that only worked for them. And nowhere is that uglier than when a safe haven stops being a shelter and becomes a private laboratory for the ultra-elite. In Skyline Valley, Shenandoah National Park is no longer protected land, it's carved up into corporate and federal exploitation sites. A natural gas well is installed by the Beisch Company, and later tied to covert assassination. The Brown House, a historical national park version of the White House, gets reduced to a hollow photo op for the last president. And then Stoltz Enterprises, a Vault-Tech affiliate, goes even further. It buys a plot in the dead center of the park and drops a grand mansion on it. That's the pattern. When the wealthy can't control the world, they purchase a smaller version of it, and whatever they make within it, whatever it may be, is called progress. Vault 63 is a perfect case study because it blurs the line between Vault-Tech experiment and elite contingency plan. And that ambiguity is the point. Vault 63 is described as Vault-Tech's largest in width, with sprawling wings across the former park and distinct research focuses: biology, chemistry, and most importantly, meteorology. It's not framed like a standard vault setup. It looks like a prestige project. Big, specialized, and built to impress. Kinda sounds like they were compensating for something. It's literally housed beneath a grandiose private mansion owned by Stoltz Enterprises, meaning the vault's existence is tied directly to the kind of wealth and influence that Appalachia keeps warning you about. So even if someone argues that this vault doesn't feel like an experiment, that's exactly why it matters. Because the experiment here isn't a single switch Vault-Tec flipped. It's what happens when the worst of pre-war society is sealed together and treated as property by the elite. And then the vault's one big promise, control, fails in the most Fallout way possible. The vault isn't completely constructed when the bombs drop, leaving everyone inside exposed. Like Vault 12, Vault 63 can't fully seal, which means nuclear fallout leaks in and the population becomes ghoulified. But because this is the early 2100s, ghouls are not a known category yet, people don't understand what's happening, what going feral means, or what comes next. Enter Hugo Stoltz, CEO of Stoltz Enterprises and overseer of the vault. Instead of accepting limits, he reaches for a shortcut, a failed government device he purchases anyway: Atlas, the atmospheric terraforming laser accelerator system. He even brings in Lieutenant Colonel James Oberlin to justify why something that dangerous belongs anywhere near a vault. Then the personal stakes hit. The ghouls turn feral fast. Hugo's brother turns, and his wife Cassidy shows signs of going feral herself. Hugo responds like an executive, not a husband or family man. He throws out safeguards and pushes activation as soon as possible, bringing his wife with him when he flips the switch. The result is immediate and brutal. Hugo is blinded. Cassidy falls into a coma, and an electromagnetic pulse surges through Vault 63, transforming many inhabitants into a new ghoul variant, the Lost. That's not a random accident. It's escalation psychology, the same mindset that decided to build a mansion in a national park. Hey, ask Nuka-Cola how well that worked out for Nuka World. When control slips, the powerful don't share risk. They magnify it, because they believe the rules exist for everyone else. The cruelest part is what comes next. The disaster doesn't remove Hugo's influence. It hardcodes it into the people he just destroyed. The Lost operate on Hugo's business-minded, logic-driven mentality, but corrupted and mind-controlled. Even after Atlas fails, Hugo doesn't stop being the center of gravity. He becomes the shepherd behind a new kind of horror. Oberlin forbids another activation, and the machine is damaged enough that rebuilding requires new parts. Audrey, Hugo's daughter, sees what he's become and rejects it, because grief doesn't excuse tyranny. And when a Vault 76 dweller arrives, the story crystallizes into outcomes that are all about power. Either help Hugo activate Atlas and turn the remaining sane ghouls into mind-controlled slaves, imprison Hugo with Oberlin, or work with Audrey to lock both self-destructive forces away. In other words, the Vault's experiment isn't just meteorology or technology, it's authority under pressure, and what an elite leader is willing to do when the people around him stop being people. Some would say there is a duality of man, and Vault-Tec certainly goes out of its way to show the best and worst humanity is capable of. On that note, let's head over to Boston really quick. Vault 88, Vault-Tec Fulfillment Center Alt 88, is one of the few times Fallout shows Vault-Tec's cruelty as a repeatable process. Not just a one-off horror story, but a production line for human experimentation. The setup is explicit. Overseen by Dr. Valerie Barstow, the Vault exists to test prototype systems meant for rollout across other vaults after 2078, under the direction of figures tied directly to Vault-Tec's grand societal preservation plan, including Dr. Stanislaus Brown, the same Braun connected to Vault 112. The experiments weren't designed as isolated curiosities. They were intended as mass-produced experiments within experiments. The Vault gives a sharp lens into how Vault-Tec operates. It reveals the infrastructure of experimentation, how the company standardized cruelty so it could be copied, shipped, and scaled. Vault 88's story becomes more disturbing after the Great War because the Vault was never finished, but the experiments can still be revived and deployed on people who never consented to any of it. When you explore Vault 88, you find the construction crew now feral and the Vault split between intact and unfinished sections. But the critical detail is that the experimental data survives elsewhere, stored at the nearby Vault-Tec Regional HQ. That means Barstow isn't stuck reinventing anything. She can recover the archived protocols and restart testing immediately. The only difference is the target population, not pre-war citizens, but the wastelanders of the Commonwealth, people with fewer protections, fewer choices, and fewer ways to fight back. This reframes Vault-Tec's evil as something even worse than mad or evil science. It's bureaucratic continuity, because society may crumble, but the paperwork survives, and the paperwork is the weapon. Which brings us to the real question Vault 88 asks. Are Vault-Tech's experiments unethical because of what they are, or because of how easily they can be adjusted? Vault 88 shows that Vault-Tech didn't just design experiments, they designed experiments with adjustable ethics. Like cruelty was a feature you could configure depending on what your manager needed that week. The 4 core prototypes, the PowerCycle 1000, Soda Fountain, Phoropter, and Slot Machine, each come with 3 configurations: an overtly abusive Vault-Tech setting, a compromise setting designed by Team Walrus, and a genuinely beneficial version created by the team of one Ted Riley. This isn't accidental. It's a system that turns morality into a menu, harmful, ambiguous, or helpful, all at the flip of a switch or the press of a button. This is one thing you won't be asking for fries with. And when you look at what the default Vault-Tech versions do, you see exactly what kind of company would treat ethics like a setting on a machine. The Vault-Tech versions of the prototypes make the intended purpose unmistakable: maximize compliance, extract productivity, and accept death as an acceptable byproduct. The PowerCycle 1000 can shock riders to squeeze out more power, up to spontaneous combustion and death. The Soda Fountain dispenses appetite-suppressant soda that drives unnatural weight loss and can escalate into fatal refusal to eat. The Phoropter uses subliminal messaging that produces headaches and can kill. And the Slot Machine turns gambling into coercion. It manipulates probabilities to lure players in, then traps them in a loss spiral that effectively locks them into indentured servitude, ensuring the vault fills its pockets while stripping away free will. Fitting for Las Vegas, only 3,000 miles away. But Vault-Tech doesn't only show the worst version. It also shows what the company considered an acceptable compromise. And that middle ground is revealing in its own way. The second configuration, created by a Team Walrus, still had Vault-Tech ideals in mind, but with a more neutral approach. Power cycles instead of shocking riders, dosed riders with buff-out, capable of making them ride for days, as well as thinking that it was the bike that made them stronger instead of the chem. Team Walrus's Soda Fountain didn't use an appetite suppressant, but instead a mood enhancer made by Hallucigen Inc. Their Phoropters were far more invasive, utilizing Rorschach tests to get glimpses into the minds of those who used it, with the default programming including traitor, inefficiency, gossip, complaint, and kitten. Finally, the Slot Machine's neutral configuration was to provide a standard game of chance, but also detect who was playing and identify deviants and degenerates without the player knowing. You've seen Vault-Tech and you've seen Team Walrus, but out of many, if not all, Vault-Tech scientists, Ted Riley is probably the most ethical pre-war person to ever work for Vault-Tech. Every one of his team's experiments were not only beneficial to Vault-Tech, but to the user as well. However, both Valeri and the R&D head both highly disapproved of Ted's objectively beneficial configurations. That didn't stop Ted though, which led to the PowerCycle emitting essential oils and pleasant music to create a wondrous experience for the rider. The Soda Fountain was plain, ordinary caffeine, but enhanced to surpass even the taste and hydration of Nuka-Cola. The Phoropter actually enhanced the eyesight of those who used it. And finally, the Slot Machine could be adjusted to lose the vault money at the cost of endless winnings for whoever used it. Obviously, Valeri Barstow prefers that the Vault-Tech configurations are used for the experiments, to the hatred of Wastelanders everywhere, but she won't mind the neutral option being used. She will, though, walk out on anyone who only uses the beneficial options devised by Dr. Ted Riley. It took 210 years, but the experiments of Vault 88 could finally be unleashed upon the wasteland, to the delight, hatred, or simply no reaction of Wastelanders everywhere. If you enjoyed this video and want to see Fallout 4's creepiest locations explained, click on the video on the screen.